Hello, I'm Meia Nouwens, IISS Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy and host of the IISS Sound Strategic Podcast. In today's episode, we'll discuss the main takeaways from the 20th IISS Manama Dialogue, held in Bahrain from 6 to 8 December 2024. The dialogue came at a momentous time for the Middle East, with ongoing conflicts and instability in the region. By the end of the dialogue, the Assad regime had collapsed. Joining me today to give their views on the themes that emerged from the dialogue, ranging from conflict resolution to post-conflict reconstruction, are Air Marshal Sammy Sampson, Executive Director of the IISS Middle East, Dr. Irene, Editor of the Armed Conflict Survey and Senior Fellow for Latin America and Conflict, Security and Development, Dr. Hasan Alhasan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy. Sammy, Irene, Hasan, welcome onto the show. Sammy, for those who aren't acquainted with the Manama Dialogue, can you give a brief introduction as to what it is?
The Manama Dialogue is an annual event. It's held in the Kingdom of Bahrain over 3 days. And essentially, it's a forum where a global community of ministers, policymakers, and decision makers can openly have a discussion about the most pressing foreign policy, regional security, and defense issues. It's been going for 20 years. 2024 was the 20th anniversary. It's established itself and it still remains a central element of the Middle East security architecture. And then perhaps most importantly, the dialogue is an opportunity. It's a space and a strong platform for the region to communicate its ambitions and to highlight its challenges, and perhaps more importantly, to also listen to allies and friends, to hear their perspectives and to develop a shared understanding.
And what were the main issues that were discussed by speakers and also brought up by the audience in this year's Manama Dialogue? Are they closely aligned to what you had expected, or were there some surprises?
They were pretty well aligned to people's expectations, not just mine, but I think the audience. People understand what the Manama Dialogue is about. They come with a common agenda to discuss issues. And now sometimes the issues change, but broadly speaking, everybody was aware of the global turbulence, absent world leadership, the rise of irresponsible state and non-state actors. And so that conditioned a number of the themes and the issues. Perhaps the first one was that almost all speakers and delegates shared the same concern for an eroding rules-based global order. They voiced unease with a rapidly changing kind of global landscape in somewhat shaped by increasing great power competition. That clearly came through. And then asking themselves, because of the nature of the region, what the role and position of medium powers such as themselves should take. Some people offered different mechanisms to cope with this. We had all 5 continents represented. So as you can imagine, the questions were focused towards sometimes issues of North America, Europe, Asia. It was that concern for an eroding rules-based global order. Perhaps the second theme and issue that came up was, from whatever continent people were from, everybody spoke of the need to correct the pathway away from accelerating crises. The global volatility, political uncertainty, and the challenge security in many aspects loomed really kind of large in the discussions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, those states that were adjacent to actual or potential conflict, whether from the Middle East, Europe, or Asia, highlighted that common trajectory. Clearly, in the Middle East, there was a lot of focus about the current security situation, but really strongly was a renewed commitment to the two-state solution and an Arab peace plan. And most importantly, perhaps, through dialogue with all parties. And that came through particularly strongly. However, what I would say in terms of a theme in every instance, whether talking about Asia, Europe, or the Middle East, whilst there appeared to be pretty clear consensus on the principles, the necessary steps remained more a work to be progressed rather than a work in progress. And then finally, the third theme, I think, expressed by pretty much everybody was the need to explore new and or complementary strategic relationships along common trans-regional trend lines, whether they were bilateral, multilateral, or multilateral. And there were some instances of agreements being signed. The United Kingdom joining the CCIPA, Canada, Bahrain defense relationship, strategic partnership, but also with a mix of different nations. There was quite a broad recognition that hardwired connectivity, whether security, trade, or tech, should be pursued and aid stability and security. and those shared dependencies as a byproduct of newer, broader strategic relationships.
You mentioned this was the 20th anniversary of the IISS Manama Dialogue. It was, of course, also your first as executive director of the IISS Middle East office in Manama, Bahrain. What were the atmospherics at the event for people who weren't able to join in person? Were they, do you think, largely optimistic or pessimistic?
It's a really interesting question. In terms of atmospherics, it felt global. There were 63 national delegations, all 5 continents represented. There was a real desire and an appetite for people to connect with the region and the region to connect with them. So as for optimistic or pessimistic, if I just describe the context in which this dialogue happened, on the first day, President Assad was in power in Syria. By the concluding plenary, his regime had toppled. The conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine continued as we debated. The IAEA president announced a dramatic increase in Iranian uranium enrichment. The French government was toppled. The German government coalition collapsed. The exact intentions of an incoming Trump administration remained pretty uncertain and discussed widely. Against that backdrop, optimism or pessimism is a difficult one, but my overriding impression was that it was neither. I think it was about realism and pragmatism, people recognizing the world that they were in and the need to communicate and engage as broadly as possible to navigate some of those challenges. It was one of practicality. That's what shone through to me in terms of the atmospherics.
Thanks, Sammy. Hasan, Sammy already mentioned, of course, the US, Bahrain, and UK announced the expansion of the Comprehensive Security, Integration, and Prosperity Agreement, also known as CCPA, to include the UK in addition to the US and Bahrain. What are the implications of this expansion, the likelihood of regional expansion, and also its fate under the next Trump administration?
Thanks, Mia. The CCPA is indeed a mouthful. This agreement, which was signed in September 2023, and which had been, until this Manama Dialogue, a bilateral agreement between the US and Bahrain, was expanded to include the United Kingdom as its third member. And of course, the agreement was always intended to be a multilateral or plurilateral agreement. It wasn't meant to be purely a bilateral one. I think what it represents is essentially an enhanced security commitment, a mutual shared security commitment, with potentially additional benefits on technology, economic cooperation, and other areas. And I think we saw Bahrain and the US make an effort to substantiate the agreement by signing a geospatial cooperation agreement during the dialogue, in addition to the expansion, in an attempt to really give this agreement more life and substance. The question, I think, at this stage is whether this agreement is going to expand regionally in a very significant way. That was always the intention. The intention was that this agreement wouldn't just include more Western partners like the United Kingdom and potentially even France, for example, down the line, but that it would really incorporate a number of regional countries that can be a part of it. I'm slightly more pessimistic on that side of things because, on the one hand, Saudi Arabia, which is the big regional country here in the Gulf, is negotiating a bilateral agreement with the United States. The scope and the ambition of that negotiation has varied over time. There was a lot of talk about negotiating a potential bilateral defense treaty between Saudi Arabia and the United States in exchange for Saudi Arabia normalizing its relations with Israel. There's now talk of a less for less agreement. But in any case, it's fairly clear that the Saudis and the Americans are negotiating on a bilateral track. Other countries in the region, including the UAE, Qatar, and others, have signed their own bilateral agreements and arrangements over the past few years with the United States as well. The other point, I think, which could potentially hamper the expansion of CCPA is the question of what happens to it, its fate under the Trump administration. President Trump had a consistent track record last time around of shredding to bits almost every single big landmark agreements that were signed by the Biden administration when Trump came into office last time around. So the Paris Climate Accord, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The question is, will Trump choose to build upon CCPA, or because of its identification with the Biden administration, choose to embark on some other form of arrangement? So I think this uncertainty about what happens to CCPA under Trump may be hampering the regional expansion of this agreement. We'll wait and see.
Another topic that was, of course, a focus at this year's IISS Manama Dialogue was with regards to Iran. What is the outlook for GCC-Iran relations in light of a weakened network of Iran-affiliated arms groups in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria? And how does Iran's weakness affect relations in the region? And also, of course, the question of what happens if Trump enforces maximum pressure and the Gulf states' ability to react to that.
So Iran has been a relevant player to almost all of the conversations, including the CCPA one, because the response that the Bahraini foreign minister gave as to the underlying logic and rationale of CCPA from the Bahraini perspective, he said was ultimately deterrence. And now he didn't say whom exactly it was meant to deter, but it's an open secret that from the Bahraini perspective, Iran looms the largest on its register of national security concerns. The broad theme at the moment for how the Gulf states are seeing their relations with Iran, in light of Iran's position of regional weakness at the moment. Many of Iran's affiliated groups in Gaza and Lebanon, the Assad regime, which is obviously has also been traditionally closely affiliated with Iran, are all either toppled, non-existent, or severely weakened and isolated. The Gulf states, nevertheless, clearly see that de-escalation and diplomatic engagement with Iran has actually worked for them so far. It has allowed them to avoid being sucked into the conflict, not because of their superior military capabilities by comparison to Israel or the United States or other, but because of this diplomatic engagement and de-escalation on which they have embarked with the Iranians. And I don't think that they're about to change that approach just yet. I think ultimately the Gulf states don't want war with Iran. And there's serious concern that Israel could unilaterally bring war to the Gulf. The notion that Israel could have struck Iranian nuclear sites or oil installations could very well have prompted a broader confrontation in the Gulf. This is the last thing that the Gulf states want to see. They also know that they are more vulnerable to potential Iranian aggression and retaliation than, say, Israel. But I think what we've also heard over the past few days, speaking off the record with Gulf officials, is that there clearly is the view that the Gulf states' strategic patience, so to speak, is not infinite. Ultimately, if Iran doesn't show serious goodwill, that the Gulf states could ultimately end up changing their approach. There's a lot of uncertainty as well about how Trump reacts to Iran, whether he reverts back to a maximum pressure posture or not. All of these are risks that the Gulf states will have to manage very carefully.
Irene, turning to you, you soft launched this year's IISS Armed Conflict Survey at the Dialogue. What are the headline conclusions from the survey for the Middle East?
Thanks, Meia. It is quite interesting because if I look at the Middle East through the global lenses of the survey, which, as you know, it's a global endeavor, what I see is really that the main characteristic we have highlighted as defining the contemporary global conflict outlook are present in the Middle East in an amplified form, I would say. So, starting with the fact that what we are seeing globally is an increasing human cost and intensity of conflict. In the Middle East, this is even more pronounced. We have some numbers that shows that there's been an increase in fatalities by 315% in the reporting period of the report, which is June 2023 to July 2024. The lethality of confrontation, we see that in the Middle East, the ratio between fatalities and event has increased around 130%, and is compared to 17% at the global level. Another element we see in general across the conflict in the world is the increasing intractability and protractedness of conflict. And this is because of a much more complicated landscape of conflict parties, overlapping agendas, foreign and domestic, and really geopolitical influence. And this is really in full display in the Middle East. We have plenty of non-state actors with different agenda, different powers. We have third party intervening in the region, and we have a lot of different kind of this overlapping between geopolitical and domestic drivers. Also, in terms of protracted nature of conflict, what we see across the world is really the fact that conflict tends to relapse for the same reason they started in the first place. And we heard a lot in Manama really about how Israel-Gaza conflict is really relapsing of causes which haven't been addressed. So I think that's actually a reminder for us when we look at conflict to really think about the importance also for root causes of conflict. And the other thing I think it's very evident in the Middle East is what we see concerningly globally, which is the demise in a way or crisis of international humanitarian law. This is actually the law that should regulate the conduct of war, in particular to protect civilian infrastructure and object. And what we see is that across the globe, it has been increasingly ignored or bypassed, especially the principle of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, which should be used during the conduct of war. The result is that there's been an increasingly targeting of civilian, directly or indirectly. And if we look at the Middle East, this is actually something we see everywhere and from different conflict parties. If we just look at the direct damage to Gaza infrastructure the last year, we see that this is something that amount more or less to 97% of the Palestinian territory's GDP in 2022. So it's actually, as I said, really amplified version of what we see across the world. The other element, which is particularly evident and amplified in the Middle East conflict, is really the increasing domestic geopolitical agency and importance of non-state armed groups as conflict parties.
Speaking about the role of non-state actors, you of course note that conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere feature a variety of non-state actors and point to the increasing role of these actors in contemporary insecurity dynamics. Can you expand a little bit on this phenomenon for us?
It is something that is very much at the heart of our research at the IISS. We have been actually observing and trying to also provide standardized information on these actors across the world, just because also they are growing in importance in terms of political and geopolitical actors, and also have increasing geoeconomic power across the world. As you mentioned, Meia, the taxonomy is very diverse. So we have groups, from the classic insurgent with a political agenda to really criminal groups whose drivers simply economic. What they have in common is really their increasing power at the time when the state reach and legitimacy is increasingly strained. So what we see domestically across the world is really how this group are increasing providing governance in alternative or in substitution to the state, how they provide basic services to the population under their control, and also they extract taxes in many ways. So they're really state within the state. The International Committee of the Red Cross collects data on armed group of humanitarian concern. And just to give you some numbers, which are quite impactful, for last year, for 2024, they count something like over 450 armed groups across the world, under which you have around 210 million people actually that lives under the contested or full control of those groups. But what is interesting is that 80% of those groups actually provide services to the population under their control, and really all type of services, really education, justice, healthcare, social support. And this is particularly evident in sub-Saharan Africa but also in the MENA region, but also across the world, even in a region like Latin America, where you don't really have groups with a political agenda. Those are actually criminal groups, used to be criminal groups entirely. In the Middle East, this trend is much more evident. We see the various Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, their importance really in MENA conflict dynamics due to actually their increasing and more important geopolitical and geoeconomic clout, and also the ability and willingness of this group to really engage and challenge geopolitical state players in pursuit of their strategic objective. What it is important when we look at this non-state group, and we heard a lot in Manama as well, it's really how do we actually deal with those groups, right, as state actors, because those are becoming increasingly a counterpart, and they should be a part of the solution. What we are going to see more and more, and what we're trying to do also at the IISS, it's really see what are the parameters within which one can actually interact or engage. What are the best way to really deal with those actors? Because I feel that really those actors are a big part of the problem, and somehow to achieve a sustainable solution, we will need to think about how to deal and how to interact with those actors.
Some of the questions at this year's dialogue focus perhaps optimistically on the topic of post-conflict reconstruction and its financing, specifically, of course, related to Gaza. For example, whether or not countries in the region would welcome China's financing of the reconstruction of Gaza. In your opinion, were these conversations premature, and where do debates currently stand on this topic?
It may be considered premature to discuss about the reconstruction, but I think it's a key preoccupation, also because it is probably going to be one of the most complex undertakings the international community has ever faced. And this is because, obviously, in the past, in general, when you look at post-conflict reconstruction effort, these normally take place in context where there is a sufficient level of government legitimacy, political convergence between the different parts in conflict. In the case of Gaza, of course, it's a very different situation. There will be probably contested views on who should be actually the political party involved in the reconstruction. There will likely be an absence of a political settlement among the different conflict parties. And this actually make very difficult to implement or copy from what has been the post-war construction effort made in the past. Even if we manage miraculously to have some political settlement and geopolitical settlement around the status of the Strip, who's going to actually be in charge of ruling it, what is the role of Hamas, even if we manage to get some clarity on that, I think the cost of the reconstruction will be exorbitant. And there will be, I think, a need to look for creative solution on how to really secure the resources needed. So we did hear a lot during the Manama Dialogue about different options in that respect. I think the GCC country will probably need to actually step in and be and lead in a way on that sense. But also we heard, for instance, from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, this idea, which I think is quite interesting, of really trying to pull up unused special drawing rights of countries in the region to create a support fund for reconstruction, which I think it's a creative idea to go through that. But also we had a great session during the Manama Dialogue on sovereign wealth funds, which Hasan orchestrated. That as well, it's maybe a way to try to involve those funds in a more catalytic way for private investment, which they're already doing in other fragile settings. The private sector will need to be involved, but of course, how do you involve? How do you actually entice them to invest in very fragile and very risky situations? So I think the sovereign wealth fund could have a role to play there. But definitely, I think it's not too early to think about it because it's going to be a formidable challenge for the international community.
Thanks, Irene. And Hasan, if I can just turn back to you one last time with a similar forward-looking question. What do you think the role of Arab Gulf states will be in post-conflict phases in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, thinking about things like their prospects for participating in peacekeeping, in aid and reconstruction, in the future of relations with Israel? Numerous angles to explore. But if I can ask you for a 3-minute answer, what would it be?
I think the baseline that we need to remember is that aid is a very important feature of the Gulf states' foreign policies. That hasn't changed in the sense that the UAE has recently launched a new aid agency, UAE Aid, and Saudi Arabia has managed many of its relations in the region, including with countries with whom it does not have very good relations, like Afghanistan or Lebanon, through aid and the provision of humanitarian assistance. We're seeing a reinvigoration, actually, of aid as a foreign policy tool on the part of the Gulf states, especially in humanitarian aid, but also potentially reconstruction. So I think that probably bodes well for a larger role on the part of the Gulf states in the kind of reconstruction and post-conflict aid that we will need to see in multiple conflict zones in the region. I think, however, there is a common emphasis among the Gulf states on the need to resolve underlying political issues, that we can't simply keep investing in reconstruction only to see the unending cycle of conflict destroy once again much of the work that has been done. And that has obviously been the case in Gaza. And I think other donors, like in the EU, probably have a similar attitude. There is another source of constraint for the Gulf states, which is that their fiscal capacity is no longer as large or as seemingly infinite as it used to be. Oil prices are not particularly high at the moment. There are questions about when OPEC Plus, of which the Gulf states are key members, will be able to increase production and bring more oil barrels back into the market. So the long-term fiscal outlook and oil revenues, I think that also places constraints on the Gulf states' ability to increase their aid. Different conflict zones have more specific considerations. In Gaza, the Arab League has already sanctioned a proposal to deploy international peacekeepers with Arab participation and to engage in post-conflict aid. The UAE has signaled its willingness to participate in such a scheme. There, very clearly, the Arab countries, the Gulf states in particular, have been clear that they wouldn't do so under an indefinite Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip. That also applies to their willingness to disperse aid. I think they're very worried about Israel's moves vis-a-vis UNRWA and what Israel is doing to bar the agency from doing the work that it needs to do. In Lebanon, there are also concerns, as always, as to whether Hezbollah will remain in control. The Gulf states had withheld for approximately 2 decades large-scale aid to Lebanon because of concerns over what Hezbollah might do with that money. So if we see Hezbollah elect a new president and take a direction in which Hezbollah plays a smaller role, then potentially we could see a resumption of large-scale aid to Lebanon. So on Syria, I think the Gulf states will need some time to see how things develop there, build trust in whichever group or party comes into power, and really allow these political dynamics to play out until we have a better understanding as to whom we're dealing with over there.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you Sammy, Irene, and Hasan for sharing your insights. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to Sound Strategic wherever you listen to your favorite podcast to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you and see you next time.